I saved for 4 years for this. Not a vacation, not a new car, not even the bathroom reno. My husband kept bookmarking on house and leaving open on my laptop like I wouldn't notice. Every extra dollar from my nursing shifts at St. Michael's and whatever I made picking up overtime on long weekends went straight into an account I called, simply, Mom and Dad in my banking app. Nobody knew about it except my younger brother, who I'd sworn to secrecy, and who helped me coordinate from his place in Kelowna. My parents had been married for 40 years come September. 40 years in the same semi-detached in Scarborough. They'd been renting since before I was born, the one with the radiator that knocked all winter and the backyard too small to set up a lawn chair without stepping on the neighbor's fence. My father, Ernie, had driven a city bus for the TTC for 26 years. The kind of work that hollows out your back and your patience. But he never once came home bitter. He'd call it honest work. He'd say that every time. My mother, Helen, had spent the better part of 2 decades doing what nobody officially counts. Raising me and my brother, caring for my father's mother during her final years, working part-time at the dry cleaners on Kingston Road to fill in the gaps when the household budget ran thin. She never complained about it, not in a way that let you feel it was meant as an accusation. She just did what needed doing and then made dinner. 40 years. They had never, not once, taken a real vacation. The furthest they'd gone together was a long weekend in Niagara Falls for their 25th. Driving down in the minivan with cracked AC, staying in a motel that smelled like carpet cleaner and lake water. My mom has a photo from that trip on the fridge still. She's laughing at something off camera, my dad has his arm around her, and they're both squinting into the sun like they've never been happier in their lives. That photo is part of why I did what I did. 8 months before their anniversary, I found a listing. A 3-bedroom bungalow on a quiet street in Prince Edward County, 40 minutes from the lake, with a wraparound deck and a garden that had been let go just enough to feel like it had potential. The area is the kind of place my parents had talked about vaguely and wistfully for years. Wine country, slower pace, the kind of Saturdays where you drive to a farmer's market and take the long way home. The listing price was $389,000. I had been putting away just over $1,800 a month for 4 years, and I had the rest covered through an RRSP withdrawal I'd been planning since I turned 32. My credit union gave me a small bridge loan to cover the gap. I signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon in March and cried in my car in the parking lot for about 10 minutes before driving back to my shift. The plan was clean. Their anniversary was a Saturday. My brother would fly in from Kelowna, tell them he had a client property to visit in the county, and could use a second opinion since they'd always been good at spotting a solid home. He'd pick them up, drive them out, and I'd be waiting with a small catering order I'd arranged through a woman I found on a local Facebook group. Charcuterie, a cake, a few nice touches for the deck. My husband Eric had taken a long weekend from his contracting job to help me get the place ready. We'd spent the previous 2 days there cleaning, hanging curtains my mom had always wanted but never bought, setting up a photo wall in the hallway with prints spanning their entire marriage. Eric's parents, his mother especially, a woman named Faye, had offered, almost before I finished asking, to help with the final setup while Eric and I drove out separately with the last of the supplies. I'd given them the lockbox code because there was still a key to be made. I thought I was being efficient. I thought I was delegating to people who loved us. That thought would cost me 45 of the worst minutes of my life. I want to explain something about Faye before I go further, because what happened that afternoon did not come out of nowhere, even if it felt that way in the moment. Faye is the kind of person who takes up space in a room in a way that always reads as warmth until you've known her long enough to notice it's actually control. She had made comments over the 5 years Eric and I had been married, about how I worked too many nights, about how nursing was admirable but exhausting to live around, about how my parents were lovely people. She'd always add that part quickly, but hadn't exactly set Eric up for the kind of life she'd imagined for him. She said these things pleasantly. She always said them pleasantly. I had absorbed them the way you absorb a draft in a house. You feel it, you pull your sweater tighter, you don't always know which window to close. I had told myself none of that had anything to do with what I was doing for my parents. I was wrong about that. My brother picked them up at noon. My mother wore the cardigan she saves for occasions, the cream one with the buttons she'd found at a thrift shop in the beaches and never stopped being proud of. My father wore his good slacks and a collared shirt, slightly too warm for September, but he'd ironed it himself, which told me he was taking the outing seriously. They thought they were doing my brother a favor. They had no idea. Eric and I got to the house 20 minutes ahead of them. I pulled into the driveway and knew immediately that something was wrong. The cedar planters I'd set out on either side of the front steps were gone. The welcome sign I'd hung above the door, something I'd had made at a shop in Picton, with my parents' initials and the year of their anniversary, had been taken down and was leaning face first against the garage wall. Through the front window, I could see movement that wasn't any of the catering staff I'd arranged. Through the side gate, which was open when it should have been latched, I could hear Faye's voice, cheerful and carrying, organizing something in the backyard. Eric touched my arm. I shook my head. I walked around to the back. Faye had rearranged the deck furniture. The bistro set I'd ordered, the one I'd chosen specifically because my mother had pointed at a similar one in a Canadian Tire flyer 3 Christmases ago and said, "Oh, isn't that nice?" had been moved to make room for a larger folding table covered in a plastic tablecloth printed with autumn leaves. On it sat serving dishes I didn't recognize, casseroles still in their foil pans, a stack of paper plates fanned out like a catering hall setup. Faye's husband, Ted, was stringing outdoor lights that weren't mine along the back fence, and Faye herself was standing in the middle of the deck, holding a glass of wine she had apparently found in the case I'd had delivered the day before, directing the arrangement of chairs like she was hosting a party. She saw me and smiled. Not the caught smile of someone who knew they'd overstepped. A hostess smile. "Welcome to my event. We completely redid the flow out here," she said, gesturing broadly at the deck. It was a bit sparse, honestly. We brought a few things from home to fill it out. I looked at her for a moment, then I looked at Eric. He was already moving toward the deck, jaw set, and I held up one hand. Not yet. My parents were still 12 minutes away. I needed 12 minutes. "Faye," I said, keeping my voice where I keep it when a patient's family member is doing something that needs to stop right now, but gently, "what happened to the welcome sign?" "It felt a bit much," she said, waving her hand. "First impressions of a property shouldn't be cluttered." "It's not a property listing," I said. "It's a home." She looked at me the way she always looks at me when she's deciding whether to hear what I've actually said. "Well, we've made it much more welcoming, I think. Ted even pressure washed the driveway, which your people hadn't done. Faye." Eric's voice, flat and very quiet. "Whose name is on the deed?" She paused. She took a small sip of my wine. "Well, technically, it's a yes or no question, Serena's," she said. The name came out smaller than everything else she'd said since I arrived. "Then you don't get to decide the flow," he said. "Put the sign back up." She looked between us for a moment, and for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't fill the silence. I walked back through the house. I rehung the welcome sign myself. I moved the cedar planters back to the front steps. I carried Faye's foil casseroles off the deck table and set them inside the garage because there was nowhere else to put them without being crueler than I wanted to be. I put the bistro set back where I'd had it, which took 4 minutes, and scraped my knuckles on the concrete, and I reset the catering table the way I'd planned it, with the cloth napkins and the small vase of wildflowers I'd cut from the property's own overgrown garden the morning before. The photo wall in the hallway was untouched, thank God. Either they hadn't gotten to it yet, or some small instinct had stopped them. My brother texted, 5 minutes out. I stood at the end of the front walk and I breathed. Faye and Ted were in the backyard when the car pulled up. I had not asked them to leave, not yet, because I didn't want my parents' first moments inside that house to be shaped by an argument already in progress. I had asked them to stay out back and stay quiet, and I had used a tone of voice that Eric later told me he had never heard me use before, a tone he described as extremely clear, and they had, for once, done what they were told. My mother stepped out of the car first. She was still laughing at something my brother had said on the drive. She had no idea. She walked up the front path looking at the garden on either side, squinting pleasantly in the afternoon light, and she said, "Oh, this is lovely. Whose place is this?" And I said, "Yours." And she stopped walking. She looked at me, she looked at the house, she looked at the welcome sign above the door, her initials, my father's initials, the year they were married, 1984. And her face did something I don't have adequate words for. It collapsed and rebuilt itself in the same second. Her hand went over her mouth. My father had come around the back of the car more slowly, still adjusting his collar, and he looked up and saw my mother standing frozen on the path, and he said, "Helen, what's wrong?" And she turned around and said, "Ernest, it's ours." And he stood there for a moment the way he stands at things he needs time to take in. Very still, very straight. And then he walked up the path and looked at the sign, and then he looked at me and he said quietly, "Mags, what did you do?" Mags, he's called me that since I was 4 years old. I've spent 32 years as Mags to him, and not a single other person on earth. I said, 40 years, Dad. That was all. He nodded, the way he nods when something matters too much for words, and he put his arm around my mother, and they stood there together in front of that door. We went inside. I showed them every room. My mother stopped in the kitchen doorway for a long time, looking at the window above the sink that faced the backyard, and she said, "I've always wanted a window like that over the sink. You can watch the garden." I told her the garden needed work, and she looked at me like that was the most wonderful thing she'd ever heard. My father walked through the whole house slowly and said very little, which is how he has always moved through things that matter to him. He stood in the main bedroom doorway for a moment, ran his hand along the frame, and moved on. We got to the back door that opened onto the deck. I had not told them yet about what had happened with Faye. I had not decided whether I was going to, or when or how. So when my father slid open the back door and stepped onto the deck and found Faye and Ted still sitting in the far corner with their paper plates and their autumn leaf tablecloth and their rearranged furniture, there was a moment of complete confusion on his face that I had no way to prepare him for. Faye stood up immediately and said with full brightness, "Ernie, Helen, congratulations, you two!" My mother looked at me. My father looked at Eric. Eric cleared his throat. "Mom, Dad." He nodded toward the door. "Inside, please." There was a moment where Faye looked like she was going to argue. I saw it, that familiar gathering, that slight lift of the chin, and then she looked at her son's face and she picked up her plate and she went inside. What happened next was not dramatic. I want to be honest about that because I think sometimes people expect a confrontation to be operatic to count as something. It wasn't. Eric sat down with his parents at my catering table, which I had reset by then, bistro chairs, wildflowers, the whole thing, and he said, "I need to explain something to you about what this house is and what it isn't, and then I need you to listen." He told them whose money had bought the house. He told them that I had been saving for 4 years without saying a word to anyone except my brother. He told them that the house was in my parents' names and that what they had done, arriving early, rearranging, replacing, effectively staging a takeover of a private gift for someone else's parents, was not something he could explain away or minimize. Faye said, "We only wanted to contribute something." "You never let us contribute." Eric said, "You contributed by taking down the welcome sign Maggie made for her parents and leaning it against the garage wall. You contributed by drinking wine from a case that wasn't yours and serving food off a table you set up in someone else's house before they'd ever set foot in it," she said. "I didn't think." "No," he said, "you did think. That's the part I've had time to understand today. You thought this was going to be a family gathering in a property that eventually becomes family. You thought mine and ours were the same thing." His father, Ted, who had been silent through all of it, said in a voice that sounded genuinely ashamed, "We should go." "Yes," Eric said, "you should." They left 40 minutes after my parents arrived. Faye paused in the front doorway and said she hoped I could understand her intentions had been good, and I told her I believed she believed that, which was all I was able to honestly say. She accepted it. Ted gave me a nod that carried more apology than anything he'd said out loud. Eric walked them to the car. When he came back in, my mother was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea from the kettle I'd stocked the day before, and my father was standing on the deck with his hands on the railing, looking out at the overgrown garden in the late afternoon light. I went and stood beside him. He didn't say anything for a while. We just stood there. A cardinal landed on the fence at the back of the yard and sat there long enough that my father pointed at it very slightly, the way he points at things he doesn't want to startle. Then he said, "You know what I've always thought about this kind of place?" I said I didn't. "I've always thought," he said, "that a garden like that, let go like that, means there was someone here once who really loved it." He looked at the overgrown roses along the back fence, the ones I'd noticed when I first walked the property and had decided, right then, were the real reason I made the offer. Someone who put time into it. And then life got complicated, the way it does, and they had to leave it. He nodded slowly. "I think we can bring it back." He turned and looked at me, and his eyes were bright in the way they get when something has genuinely reached him, and he said, 40 years, you said." 40 years, Dad." He put his arm around my shoulders and didn't say anything else, which is how he's always said the things that matter most. Inside, through the kitchen window, I could see my mother standing up from the table and moving toward the kettle to make more tea, already at home, already belonging to the room. The string lights I'd originally planned to hang along the deck railing, the ones I'd had to repack into their box while resetting everything after Faye. Eric hung them while my brother kept my parents occupied in the hallway, talking them through the photo wall print by print. By 7 o'clock the deck was lit, The catering was out, and we were all four sitting together outside in the September air while the garden went dark around us. My mother asked me twice during dinner how I'd done it. I told her about the account in my banking app. I told her about the night shifts and the overtime Sundays and the RRSP I'd been building since I was 29 for exactly the kind of thing I couldn't yet name. She kept shaking her head in small incremental movements, the way she does when she's absorbing something she can't quite fit into the version of the world she'd been carrying. My father did not ask how. He seemed to understand that how was beside the point. He just said at one point, looking at the lights strung along the railing, "This is the kind of evening I always thought was for other people." "It's for you," I said. He nodded. "I know that now." My parents spent their first night in that house on a September Saturday, 40 years to the month, after they'd stood in a church hall in East Toronto and promised each other everything, with very little certainty about what everything would cost, and no idea what it would return. My father walked the garden with a flashlight before bed, the way he used to walk the perimeter of our yard in Scarborough when we were small, checking the fence line, making sure of things. My mother sat on the deck long after we'd moved inside, with a blanket from the hall closet I'd stocked the week before, looking at whatever there is to look at in a quiet county night when you're 64 years old, and someone has just handed you the life you'd been kind enough to stop expecting. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her, and did not interrupt. Some things you give and then you let them be given. You don't stand in the middle of them explaining yourself. You just let the person have what they've been given, fully, without you in the frame. That's what 40 years of watching two people love each other, with very little margin, teaches you if you're paying attention. I was paying attention.